Hello everyone and welcome to the first Soils Network of Knowledge webinar for 2018. First I'll introduce myself. My name's Abigail Jenkins. I'm one of two soil development officers with the New South Wales Department of Primary Industries and I'm located in Wollongbar. The other is Luke Benge and he's in Dubbo and he's also with us this morning. So today we're going to have a bit of a myth-busting webinar, and our myth-buster today is Budiman Minansi from the University of Sydney, where he's a professor in soil landscape modelling. Budi's passionate about the role of soil in managing climate change, food, water, energy security, and maintaining biodiversity. His research interest is in digital soil mapping and modelling, but today, as I mentioned, he's going to bust some myths about the widely held belief that increasing soil organic matter will increase soil available water levels.
Okay, thank you, Abby, and thanks, Luke, for organizing this, and thanks to New South Wales DPI. So my name is Budiman Minasni, or you can call me Budi. So I work at the University of Sydney. So I'm speaking to you at the Australian Technology Park here in Sydney. So just a little disclaimer before we go on to that this webinar should not be interpreted that we don't need to increase or add organic matter in the soil, as it has a little effect on water holding capacity. So that's a little disclaimer, then we'll go through. So we all know that increasing soil organic matter or soil carbon is a good thing. It promotes aggregation. So on this picture here, you can see that the soil aggregates clumped together. It's because of the roots and organic matter which hold it together. It also have increased nutrition or nutrients cycling and availability, and also there's an increase because soil stores lots of carbon, and carbon is the currency of the climate change. So if we can put some of the carbon or CO2 out from the atmosphere into the soil, we can do some good thing to the climate, soil carbon sequestration. But one of the things that is often promoted and often believed is that we can increase a lot of the water holding capacity by adding organic matter. So we hear it all the time, and it's also written in papers and articles all the time. But what came to our research is that what is really the evidence that's saying that, what is the evidence that show that adding organic matter can increase water holding capacity? So the first thing people do, and I like to do, is to ask Dr. Google. So if you Google soil organic matter and water holding capacity, it tells you that organic matter can improve your soil's water holding capacity. And then each 1% increase in soil organic matter helps hold 20,000 gallons more water per acre. I'm not sure. So I'll try to translate this into a more understandable, or the units I'm more used to it, and I'll just try to explain where this number comes from. So a little bit of math. So the big assumption in this calculation that it assumes that organic matter holds 10 times of its holds water 10 times of its weight. That's a big assumption. So we'll go through it again later. So how does they come about to this number? So it assumes that 1 hectare it's a 15 centimeter topsoil, the top 15 centimeter soil, and a bulk density of 1.3 tons per meter cube. And the mass of the soil within that hectare, the topsoil, is 1.3 times 15 centimeters times 1 hectare, and that's 1,950 tons per hectare. So if we say that 1% of organic matter, that's 19.5 tons per hectare. And it also says that within that 1% of organic matter, it can hold 10 times of its mass. So that's 195 tons of water. And if we convert it into liter, that's about 195,000 liters of water. Or in terms of millimeters, that's 19.5 millimeters. But all of this number, it's based on a big assumptions that organic matter can hold 10 times of its mass, of its weight. So that's a very big assumption, and there's no evidence, if you look through it, there's no evidence from any evidence that this comes from any research or this comes from any experiments. It's just based on this assumption. So we want to look into further into whether this number is really realistic or not. So, and the other thing I want to add during this presentation, I talk about organic carbon. So because and we assume that organic matter is made up about 50% of organic carbon. So when I talk about OC, that means that's organic carbon. So before we go through the research and the results, I want to go through a simple soil physics explanation about how soils hold water. So pardon me for those who knows this, but because this is a wider audience, I need to go through some simple explanation of how soil holds water. So in soil water, there's 3 conditions that that we say how water is held in the soil. So of course, water is held in between the pores of the soils. So the picture on your left is a scanning electron microscope of organic matter. Is from a pit. So this is organic materials, and this is the zoom in or the enlargement is this little bar is a 500 micrometer or a millionth of a meter. So usually water is held between the pores or between the spaces of this organic matter, between the spaces. And this is what we usually call the capillary water, because these are particles, solid particles. Water is held in between these particles. That's called capillary water. But water is also held within the actual solid particles. It is absorbed within the solid particle. But most of the water under saturation means that all the pores are filled with water, is held mostly by capillary water. So if we imagine that this is 100% volume, so how many percent of it is solid and the rest of it is water. So this is water under saturation. That means that all the pores are filled with water. But those water are not fully available to plant, or those waters are only in condition where you have a huge amount of rain, or you do a flooded irrigation. That means that you flood all the pores, all the pores are filled with water. But that's in a very rare condition. And after a while, after a couple of days, usually all those water that's in the big pores will drain away because of gravity, and also some of it will evaporate. So all the water that remains available to plant is what we call fill capacity. That means that those excess water in the large pore that, well, it has drained away, and the amount of water that is retained by the pores and that are readily available is what we call the fill capacity. And if you look at this picture of on your left of the scanning electron microscope of the organic matter, so at saturation, all the pores will be filled with water, but at fill capacity, this is around this size, the water will remain in this kind of pores, and this is smaller size pores. And if you look at it, this is 20 micron and this is 500 micron. So these are water that are really available, really readily available to plant. So when we talk about water holding capacity, we have to differentiate what does it mean with water holding capacity. So the previous example, it says that those are water under saturation, under saturated conditions. So while the usual definition is that the water that are available to plant is the water at fill capacity and between wilting point. So wilting point is another condition when the water is drained away, the water has evaporated until that point that the plant can't take the water anymore, or the plant has started to wilt. So in the scheme, that this is a fill capacity. So fill capacity is this amount of water, and wilting point is this amount of water. And between field capacity and wilting point, this is available water. So now we have this concept of saturation, field capacity, and wilting point. We look into the literature. So what does the literature say about the effect of organic matter on the field capacity and wilting point? So this is one of the review in 2003 by Walter Rawls and colleagues from the USDA. And they look into the literature, and the literature itself has a bit of conflicting. Some authors says this is field capacity, this is wilting point. So some of the literature says, so yes, it affects organic matter, affects field capacity. But some literature says, no, it doesn't affect. So there is also not a general consensus whether organic matter has an effect on field capacity and also on wilting point. So this is a review from 2003. But the one that people always quote is this paper by Hudson in 1987, which shows that this is percentage of organic matter by mass. So this is percent organic matter, and this is percent of water on the y-axis, percent of water by volume. So what it says that this is increasing organic matter, you increase largely a huge number of field capacity and also permanent wilting point. So what it says that if there's a large effect between this field capacity and wilting point, this is the available water capacity. So you can increase from 5 to say 25, about 20 to 30% of available water capacity. And we look further into the literature, whether this is really what's been found in most of the time, or what's really the general consensus. So we conducted a literature review and meta-analysis. That means that we go into the literature and look into what does the study says about the effect of adding organic matter into field capacity and wilting point. So there are organic matter treatment studies. That means that there are studies where people add organic matter as a treatment to the soil for various reasons. There's about 20 studies that look into this. And what we did is that we plot the soil organic carbon, how much soil organic carbon content in the soil. And then this is the water content at various field capacity and saturation. And then we draw a regression line, and the slope of this regression line is an indication of how much increase is in percent volume of water with every percent increase in soil organic carbon. And the second one is we look in the literature on the pedotransfer functions. So pedotransfer functions just meaning that people make a functions relating organic matter to field capacity. It could be a simple pedotransfer functions, as I showed you in the previous slide, but sometimes it could be a different function. So usually, for example, they say field capacity is a function of sand, silt, clay, and organic matter, and we look into the effect of increasing organic matter on the field capacity. Sometimes it also could be some kind of a complex equation like this, which is quite a challenge to digest. But anyway, we look into all these studies on the pedotransfer functions, and we calculated the rate of increase in volume of water with every 1% increase in soil organic carbon. And now also we look at the soil database. We have a large amount of soil database where they have analyzed the water content at field capacity, the water content at wilting point, the water content at saturation. And we fit, this is 9 database, some Australian soils, some from a worldwide collection of soils. Approximately, we got about 50,000 samples. So we fit an equation which says that this symbols here mean water content is a function of clay, sand, and also organic carbon. So this coefficient, what we call B3, is a coefficient that indicates if 1% increase in organic carbon, how much of it will increase the water content. So altogether, we have about roughly 50,000 observations worldwide where we want to see what's the relationship between increasing amount of organic carbon and the water content. So what do we found? So let me explain to you what this graph is about. So SAT means saturation, water content at saturation, like this. FC means fill capacity, that's the upper limit of available water. WP means that wilting point, that is the water content when the plant starts to wilt. And available water capacity, AWC, is the difference between fill capacity and wilting point. So this is different conditions: saturation, fill capacity, wilting point, and available water capacity. And the y-axis is that slope, that increase in percent volume of water with every 1% increase in soil organic carbon. So every 1% increase of soil organic carbon, this is the amount of volume of water we expect it will increase. And this is for general texture, all texture. And then this one, the second panel, is for coarse texture, that means a sandy soil. And the third panel means that this is for fine texture or clay soils. So this is what they call a violin plot. Apparently it's meant to be shaped like a violin. I don't know, it looks like a vase to me. But anyway, so what it is it's showing the distribution of the data from all these studies that I've collected. So the fatter it is, that means that those numbers are more studies are indicating those numbers. So, and the three bars, the three lines here, it means that the middle one means that this is the median or the average value that is found in the literature, and the lower line here, is the 25 percentile. That means that in the whole distribution of the data, the lower 25% says that's the limit, and the upper line is the 75 percentile. So we're looking usually in between these values and the middle line. That means that the median. So what we found is that irrespective of texture, usually the general trend is that the increase in water content is usually largest at water content at saturation. And then it decreases at a fill capacity, and then further decrease in a wilting point. And because available water capacity is in between fill capacity and wilting point, that is in between. And what's also the actual number of increase in water, percent volume of water, is relatively small. That means that on average for a general texture, that's about 2.5 to 3% volume increase. With every 1% increase in organic carbon, you only get a 3% increase in water saturation. And in fill capacity, that's about 1.5 to 2. And in wilting point, it's quite small, less than 1% of increase in volume. So, and overall, the increase is relatively small. It's just around 1% increase in volume with 1% increase in organic carbon. This is in general texture. That means all texture from sand to clay. But if we look separate out the sandy soils, we can see that the sandy soils, the increase is much higher, but it's also not that high. So the increase is in saturations is higher. So this is around 4. But fill capacity also, the fill capacity increase is also not that large. It's around 3, and the wilting point is around 1. And the overall increase in available water capacity is around 1.5 to 2. And in finer texture, the increase is relatively small. So if we look at more detail in the table, so just repeating again that under saturation, the average is around 3% increase, and then fill capacity is 1.6. Wilting point is quite small, 0.1, and overall the increase is available water capacity is just 1%. But for coarse texture soil, for sandy soils, the increase is about 2% of water. For medium texture soil, the increase is about 1.8, and for fine texture soil is 1.4. So compare with what we have before, that the increase is 10 times it's the volume of the 10 times the mass of organic matter. That is not true. That even at saturation, the increase is just 2% to 1%. So if we take the logic of an increase of 10 times, then it should be 10% volume increase. But that's not the case. The maximum we can get is around 2 to 3%. So if we plot it, that this is organic carbon, so it's from 1%, 2% to 5%, and this is the volume of water, and the upper line is the field capacity. That's the maximum limit of available water, and the lower line is melting point. That is the lower limit. So if we look at it carefully, and if we do a bit of calculation, actually this is the region where there's a possible increase in organic carbon or organic matter. Between, say, if your soil is degraded, is 0.5% of organic carbon, you want to raise it to 1.5. This is the possible organic carbon increase that you can get. And this range to 5% or 4% or 3%, where you have a large increase, is impossible. It's impossible under general agriculture practice to increase your carbon to up to 3% or even 5%. It takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of organic matter to add in the soil. So that's why I'm saying that the increase in available water is relatively small. So if you increase from, say, 0.5% to 1.5%, you're only increasing about available water capacity, the maximum about 2%. So this graph is a response surface. I'll explain what it means. So this is the x-axis is clay content. That means that the amount of clay. So the region with low clay content, that means these are sandy soils. The regions with high clay content, this is clay soils. So we see the response. This is an average response. So say from 1% or 2% organic carbon, the response is quite large usually, under a very small amount of clay or very sandy soil. So you can expect an increase several percent or 3 to 5% with an increased organic carbon of 1%. But with increasing clay content, you'll see that the increase diminishes. The increase diminishes. And also the increase largely is on water content at saturation, when it's saturated. And at field capacity, you can see the increase is relatively small, just few percent. And in wilting points, the increase is much smaller. So if we are talking about what's the best chance of increasing water holding capacity or available water capacity, is you want to target your sandy soils that has a clay content, say less than 30%. That's your maximum chance. Or if your soil is pure sand, or your soil is just 5 to 10% clay, then that's your best chance of increasing the water holding capacity. But overall, the loamy soil and clay soils, the increase is relatively small. Excuse me. So, but people told me that they have seen lots of examples where adding compost or adding organic matter has huge effect on the water holding capacity. So we look into the detailed study where people, in a pot study, where people do amendment of organic matter. So this is one study from a PhD student here at the University of Sydney. So he is trying to add compost to a mine spore. So mine spore usually are sandy materials. They try to rehabilitate it. So they add compost to see how much water holding capacity it can improve and aggregation it can improve. So this is what we call as a water retention curve. So basically it describes the state of the water. So under saturation, when this is the potential is 0, this is water content at saturation. And the value here, 10 kilopascal, is what we call as a field capacity in Australia. So this curve describes the relationship between the amount of water it can hold under different potential or under different pressure. So under control, where the organic matter or organic carbon is very low, you have a low water holding capacity, you have a low saturation condition around 35%. And the red line refers to when it has been added 6% of compost and they have incubated, and they have incubated for at least 6 months before they reanalyze the data. And the increase in organic carbon is 1.75%. So this is quite a lot. So, and this is 6% of compost. But if you look carefully, the effect of 6% of compost or increase in 1.75% of carbon only affects the water content at saturation, mainly affects water content at the larger pores. At field capacity, the difference is quite small, tiny, less than only maybe 1%. But if we look carefully, the green line, so the green line is when they add 12% of compost. That's a lot of compost. And the purple line is when they add 18% of compost, that increase carbon to 3 to 5%. Only when you add 12% to 18% of compost, you can see marked difference in the water holding capacity or water content at field capacity. Just a reminder, if we take the 15 centimeter hectare, that means that 10% of compost, you need to add 195 tons of compost per hectare. Times it by how much cost of compost per ton, you can see whether it's viable to increase, whether there's a viability to increase the soil to 10%, or whether it's viable to add 10% of compost to the soil to increase your water holding capacity. And if we look at the plot, this is amount of organic carbon in the soil and the water content in the soil. At saturation, the increase of 1% carbon is around 3.7, so it increased the saturation level. But at field capacity, the increase is also around only at 2%. So that means that if you want to increase a lot, if you want to increase it to say 10%, you need to increase your carbon level to 5%. That means that you need to add 20% of compost in your soil. So that doesn't make sense. So, and then what about no-till? So no-till, of course, is good for the soil because it increases carbon level, but it also increases the soil health, and it also increases the aggregation. But all studies on the best management practice, including no-till, the annual carbon sequestration rate is only 0.1 to 1 tons carbon per hectare. So if we convert it into percentage of topsoil, 15 centimeter, that means every year your increase is only 0.005 to 0.05% carbon every year. So if you want to increase it to 1%, you need to at least wait until 20 years before you can get an increase in 1%. And 1%, as we said before, even on the sandy soil, your best bet of getting an increase in available water capacity is 3% of water. So you can work it out whether it's feasible or not to add that amount of water, carbon in the soil to increase that amount of water. That means that under the best sequestration potential, the annual increase is very small. And the no-till effect is also a complex relationship. It's not a direct relationship that if you have no-till, that means you have a lot more carbon, and then more carbon, that means that you have more porosity and more water stored in the soils. So on your right is the study from the US. So when they do no-till, it's a clear outcome that with increasing carbon content, so you get a decrease in bulk density or you get an increase in porosity. But on your left-hand side here, this is a study from the long-term study in Germany more than 10 years, I believe, that they say they compare conventional tillage and no-till. So it's true that no-till have a higher organic carbon in the soil. But on the graph here, this is conventional tillage and no-tills. This is pore sizes, the number of the volume of pores. It shows that conventional tillage actually has more pore sizes compared with no-till, which sort of makes sense. That means that because conventional tillage, you are keep tilling the soil, so it's more porous. That means that it's more porosity. And no-till, because you haven't tilled it for a while, that means that compaction will eventually happen. But I'm not saying that this example is not saying that the conventional tillage will perform better. It's just saying that with relations to pore sizes, with relations to the amount of water it can hold, it's not a straight relationship. In these cases, in the German long-term no-till experiments, no-till actually store less water than conventional tillage. And we also have reports. This is one report from a Union of Concerned Scientists that says that how farmer can fight floods and droughts by increasing organic matter. But what we need to see that what they are promoting is that it's just not adding organic matter, but the whole system. That means that incorporating perennials, incorporating cover crops, incorporating livestock, which makes sense that if you have a cover crop, that means that you'll have less evaporation and then less runoff and then less better, more water holding capacity. But I'm still not sure about the actual rate itself. And if you look at one of the figures, it says it's % of studies resulting in increased water absorption. So it's percentage of studies, is not the actual percentage of amount of water it can hold. So there may be indirect effects, but that depends on the soil types and rates of organic matter and also the practice. So organic matter, if you add organic matter on the surface of the soil, that also depends on the rate, how much you add. It can have a mulching effect. That means that it prevents it from evaporation and also reduce soil temperature. And adding organic matter, it can have an increased aggregation, soil aggregate. So soil clumps together, holds together, and have better porosity, as we see before. And then it could increase water infiltration, the amount of water entering in the soil under the rain event or flood event. It could reduce runoff, and it could increase porosity, and increase porosity as well. It could increase the aeration, the amount of air in the soil. That means that there's more oxygen in the soil that the plant can explore and exploit. And reduce evaporation, reduce soil temperature, increase water infiltration, can have a higher water content in the soil. But it is sort of an indirect effect, and it's not just about the organic matter itself, but it's about the mulching effect and the infiltration effect. And talking about infiltration, when we published our study, my colleague he used to work in the USDA, he showed me that his paper, which actually showed that increase in the effect of organic matter in infiltration is also not that clear, because even in some studies, the effect of organic matter is also not clear. But that's not the topic for today. We can talk about it other days. So the statement that addition of organic matter will significantly increase soil water holding capacity, I hope I can convince you that this infograph is busted. As a summary, to wrap up, that evidence-based results. So we have, when we make a claim, we have to base it on evidence-based, like as in medicine, when they recommend treatment, for example, for lower back pain or for other conditions. They look into the randomized control design and look at which studies actually give you the best recommendation, which studies actually are better than just doing a control study. So it's the same for soil as well. We have to look at the evidence. We have to look at the literature. What does the literature show? So the evidence-based results shows that the effect of addition of organic matter to available water capacity is very modest. The average value is between 1.5 to 2% volume of water with every 1% increase in organic carbon. So, but sandy soils are more responsive. So if you want to target sandy soils, if your soil is sandy, less clay, adding organic matter may help. The 2 millimeters or 3 millimeters may actually help hold more water in the soil. But for loamy soil and clay soils, the effect is very, very small. And the largest effect is on the larger pores. That means under saturation, it can hold more water, but that doesn't mean that those water will be available to plant. But adding organic matter is a useful thing to do, although it doesn't increase the water holding capacity that much, but it is improved soil aggregation, it improves microbial activity, increased porosity, infiltration, nutrient cycling, etc. That's a wonderful thing to do, and also for carbon sequestration, and farmers can get credit for adding more carbon in the soil, storing carbon in the soil. That's a wonderful thing to do. That's the thing that we should not forget. But the effect of water holding capacity is not that large, and it's minimal. That's about it, what I want to say. So we have a paper, if you want to learn more details of what we do in the studies and what are the assumptions and what data we use, there's a paper, and if you can't get it, you can email me, I can send you the paper. And finally, I want to dedicate this to two of our colleagues who just recently passed away in the beginning of 2018. So Professor Collis George, he was the professor in soil physics here in the University of Sydney since the 1960s. He passed away recently. And then Professor Inaku Ode, he's a professor in the rural spatial information. So he did a lot of work on digital soil mapping and soil mapping in New South Wales and throughout the world. So he also recently passed away. So I dedicate this presentation to both of them. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Budi. That was great. And I have a few comments and questions already. Hercules has asked, well, he said a few things actually. One of the first thing he said was, will the soil water holding capacity improvement will depend on the quality of the organic matter that's applied. Would you like to comment on that to start with, Budi?
Yes, of course. I mean, it depends on the quality as well. I mean, organic matter, there's different types of organic matter, but generally speaking, that what we say is that the organic matter which has been converted in the carbon in the soil, that means that it has gone through the decomposition process and it's in the form that is what we call as carbon. So that's
what you're talking about. Yeah.
Yes.
He's also asked a few questions about other research, and so one of the questions was, did you look at soil biological activity levels and its effect on soil moisture levels? So that's one question.
Mm-hmm. So the effect on the biology, I mean, we didn't look into that because we look totally, I mean, there are studies which include adding mycorrhiza. There's mycorrhiza that add plant materials. We didn't look specifically into that. I mean, adding mycorrhiza helps a little bit, but sometimes it's also the difference will not be substantial.
Yeah. Okay. And then he's also asked, are there any studies that that measure kind of what we've talked about, the type of organic matter that's added, whether it's, you know, fully composted or uncomposted and raw, and the effects of these on soil moisture availability over different time scales?
So I mean, as I said before, I mean, most of the studies they would have already incubated at least 6 months to 1 year before they measure it again. So I don't have the details about the different studies. I mean, a lot of the early studies on organic matter are actually, I mean, sewage and sludge and so on. So I mean, the results are similar. The results are that's what you see. That's what the statistics say.
Yep. Okay.
So the things that that will affect is the material that will bind the particles together. So for sandy soils, for example, clays that will bind the particles together, that will help. But again, I don't have the number of the actual amount.
Yeah. I was just going to ask, is it somewhat a function of the pore size that are generated by different activities?
Yes, it's the function of pore sizes. It could be the microbial activities also affected the smaller sizes, but the smaller size pores doesn't hold much water, and the increase is not compensated by that. So most of it is due to the increase in aggregation and in the larger pores where
Yeah, that's right. Okay, Justine, who's listening all the way from Hawaii, which is pretty exciting. She said organic matter is a very broad term, and is there any evidence that looks at manures versus woody materials, or the different carbon to nitrogen ratios of the organic matter that's applied?
Yes, I agree. I mean, it's a broad term, and it depends, as previous previous audience say, that that depends on different types of different forms of carbon, so manure and plant materials and so on. So yeah, I mean, we didn't look into specifically, but because we just compile all the statistics, so all the statistics would have contain all different organic materials. So yeah.
Okay.
But
all right.
I would still say to the same conclusion that the effect. I mean, so when we're talking about organic carbon, organic carbon is the form of organic matter that's already been incorporated in the soils. It's not the debris of organic. It's not the plant debris or the organic material that you see out.
Yeah.
By yeah. So in that way, that's the material that's already been decomposed or stable in the soil.
Yeah, I think that's important to note too. Carl Anderson has asked you to comment on any actual increase in the available water capacity given the better infiltration and less evaporation in any of the studies.
So it depends on what we mean by water holding capacity. I can't seem to find. I mean, there are few studies that shows that under mulching, under reduced evaporation, you have a higher moisture content, but I don't have the actual number.
Yep. Okay. And Sophie's actually said this. It's a question that you cannot look at one factor on its own. The soil is a living thing functioning under so many different conditions, not just the soil organic matter that is increasing the soil water holding capacity, but a myriad of factors. So she thinks that the statement that organic matter can improve soil water holding capacity still stands. Did you want to comment on that?
Yes, I mean it's the evidence doesn't seem to. I mean, because the data, it comes from all different different experiments, all different conditions, and the range of the values, the statistics that it holds is that the increase is not high, it's not that much. And I know that I mean under but under what condition? I mean, rarely that your soil, even especially in Australia, rarely in the condition where you have a saturation all the time, or rarely that in the condition that you have water at fill capacity.
Okay. Lauren's asked, what were the methods that were used to measure the organic matter levels in these studies? And were they different from one study to the next?
Yes, that's a good question. That's because they come from all different studies around the world. There will be differences. Some of it will still use the Walkley black permanganate oxidation, and some newer studies will use the combustion, dry combustion. But I don't think that will have a large effect on the results.
Yeah. Okay. All right. That was a good question. Now, Hercules also asked a question about whether sometimes there's a natural hydrophobicity that's that occurs when organic matter is decomposing or there, and would that affect what's happening?
Yeah. Yes, I mean, yeah, there could be a problem of hydrophobicity, but I don't think that, I mean, not, I think that's under certain special condition, I would say that.
I think the thing also to mention is that, which is what you said before, it's the scientific investigation process. So you collecting lots of information from lots of different conditions and aggregating those. And it's not to say that these strange outlier things don't happen. It's just that they're not the bulk of the things that happen. And that's that's how science works. That's how the science method works. So it's important for people to understand that.
So maybe I'll just go back to this slide. So as Abby has mentioned, so what this slide is showing that these are all the numbers from all these different studies that reported the percentage of increase. So all the percentage of increase, when I'm saying small, is that a lot, even the one that's what we call the outlier or the highest value, it never reached up to 10%. It never reached out to what it was claimed to have. So that most of the studies only reported most of the studies all around the world. That's about 50,000 data points all around the world that the actual increase is around 2 to 3%. So it's under different condition and under different organic matter and under different soil types.
What else? We've got lots of comments. It's quite good. Doris has said that has made a comment that the improvements in soil organic matter often lead to an increase in the depth of the A horizon and also the rooting depth of a plant. And so an increase in available water would then be due to the increased storage capacity with that depth and better rooting systems and access to water and things like that. So, which is outside the scope of what you've looked at. Is that correct?
Yes and no. So as I said before, that it depends also, like if the amount of organic matter that you add has increased the A horizon, that means that your organic matter addition will be huge, and that's that, I mean, under general agricultural practice, under broad acre farming, under general agricultural practice, that will not happen unless you do something radical, that you add a lot of organic matter.
Yeah.
So maybe I should repeat that. I mean, if you add, like I said before, that if you add 10% of compost, you'll see a large increase. But whether that is feasible for you to add 10% of compost under general farming practices, maybe under horticulture it's feasible, but under general practice,
that's a lot of compost.
Yes,
all right.
A lot of money.
yeah, that's a lot of compost, a lot of money. Steve Kimber has a question.
Thanks, Abby. Thanks, Budiman, for a great presentation, and thank you especially for your dedications to O'Day and College George. I'm just wondering what the significance of this small increase in available water is, and even though 1% seems very small, does this buy you a few days between the plant suffering and getting through to the next rainfall event? Maybe it's something that needs some stochastic modelling done. What's your views on that?
No, we haven't done any modelling. I mean, it's assuming that there's a 1%, assuming that there's a 1% increase. Under drought condition, I can't answer on top of my head what's its effect on the drought condition, whether this 1% can actually help the plant in there.
Okay. Doris also wanted to know if the organic matter increase would help reduce evaporation losses.
Yes, that's if you have a mulching effect, if you have a mulch on top of the soil. But if it's just incorporated in the soil, I don't see how it will reduce the.
Yes, that stands to reason. Okay. Doris has asked, did the sampling depth differ in the studies in terms of, I guess, where the measurements were taken?
Yes, most of the studies are from topsoil, and I mean there's one analysis where we do both topsoil and subsoil. So the interesting part is in that paper we discussed is that we found that the actual increase in the subsoil actually has more pronounced effect compared if you're increasing in the topsoil. So what we think is that because the topsoil is always cultivated, so the effect is not as clear as what people believe it is. But the subsoil, because I think an increase in carbon is more under natural conditions, so it actually has slightly larger effect, not huge, but slightly larger effect than the topsoil.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. Okay, and BP Singh, who's one of our researchers here at DPI, has a really long question. So here we go, BP. I've agreed it's quite challenging to increase soil organic carbon in cropping systems and have any good relationship between that and the water holding capacity. So what practices would you suggest to improve soil organic matter in farming systems, which is beneficial in sandy soils, but still important in loam and clay and loam soils? As we know, soil organic matter will improve soil structure and porosity with the potential to retain some good water. Would you recommend constant organic matter input, such as through incorporating a cover crop, which would increase the plant and soil biodiversity, improve soil structure, porosity, and then improve the water retention and infiltration? Or what about adding some useful organic amendments such as biochar, which have relatively high porous structure and can also help retaining water in the soil? Got all that?
Yes, I think BP should know much more than me. So yes, I mean, I think in many of the carbon studies and the usual practice, no-till, cover crop, and and all different best management practices are very useful. I mean, even if it doesn't increase the water holding capacity a lot, but it's still under it's still helpful and it's still useful, especially in the farm cropping soils, which has been depleted in organic carbon, to get it back to what it should be. So and whether biochar, that's another thing. I would expect the effect of biochar will be similar to what we found, but I haven't got time to do the analysis yet. I mean, I know that there are few papers that show that biochar has a large effect on the water holding capacity, but I suspect that those few studies are depending on the amount of addition and that's one thing. Well, I would like to do later, but I don't know.
And I think there's also the issue around that is what you said before. Is it going to be doable in an agricultural system, and is the biochar available, and how much is it, and all that sort of stuff, which is unknown at this stage. Vicky just wanted you to clarify about the subsoil organic matter. So she said, are you saying that if organic matter is deep down, that the water holding capacity is better or the same?
No, what we found in our study is that the effect of organic matter increase if we compare topsoil and subsoil, is that the subsoil has a slightly larger effect of increased water holding capacity compared with topsoil. So, which I think it's because of the topsoil is because it's
already better.
It's commonly it's already better, and the subsoil's probably less organic matter and less disturbance, so the effect will be clearer or much a bit higher than topsoil.
Okay, I have a point of clarification for Carl's question, which I think is going to be useful for everyone, so I'm going to read it out. What he wanted you to comment on was the actual increase in the plant available water, that is between fill capacity and wilting point, rather than the absolute increase in capacity, given the better infiltration and less evaporation under prevailing rainfall or irrigation events in any of these or other studies.
Yes. So what this analysis, I'll go back to this. What this analysis is that it's showing the different amount of water, so water under saturation, water under fill capacity, water under wilting point, and water and available water capacity. So what we're saying that the increase in available water capacity is very small, and even water at saturation, there's a larger increase, but it's also it's limited depending on the amount that you add. So what the later part of my slide is that there may be other indirect effect of the capacity to store itself may not be increased, but there may be chances under certain condition when it has a reduced, when it has better structure, it reduced runoff. That means that more water is in the soil rather than evaporating or runoff.
Okay, great. And I think that is all, although I just ask Luke and see if he has any questions.
Look, there was only the one. I think everything's been pretty covered, but there was just the one, Budi, that in your paper you mentioned the use of minus 33 kilopascals. That's the definition of field capacity. In Australia, we generally use minus 10. And how would this affect your results?
Yes, I mean, yeah, there are slightly different ones. There's some studies use minus 10, some studies use minus 33, but generally that doesn't affect the results much. And we also look at also other studies when they measure field capacity in the field. That's a more dynamic one. That means that wet up a plot and then you cover it and then you let it drain and then you measure it until it's field capacity. And also the results are very similar that the increase in the field capacity is not large.
Great.
Okay. Thank you. Well, I think it's been a great presentation, and I'd really like to thank Budi very much. And I'd also like to thank Mick Rose, who's actually not online anymore, but he, at his suggestion of having Budi present on this, because it is a question and a comment that's come up quite often in some of the webinars we've had. So it's been really good to have the myth busted to a certain extent, and in a very clear and concise way. So thank you very much, Budi, and thank you everyone for attending. So we'll see you all next month, hopefully.